Hi, everyone. This is Suzanne Simon with Restore America's Estuaries. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Living Shorelines Community of Practice virtual gathering, which today will be a webinar on the efficacy of living shorelines approaches to extreme weather events. For those of you who have not joined us before, this is a typically monthly gathering, usually the third Wednesday of every month, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern. Because of the holidays, the end of the year sometimes gets a little bit slightly different. So for those of you who are joining us again for a first time, Restore America's Estuaries is a national organization dedicated to the protection and restoration of bays and estuaries as essential resources for our nation. This is a map of our 10 member groups, without whom we would not be able to do what we do, along with all of you, our fabulous partners. So a couple of housekeeping notes before we get going in earnest. Everyone is on mute. If you have a question, you can use the control panel within the webinar software that you have on your computer to either raise your hand virtually and I will unmute you and you can talk to the group, or you are welcome to use the questions box also on your control panel, and I will feed those questions to the group and or answer them as I can. We are recording, so mind your P's and Q's, and we will be posting this on the Ray YouTube channel once we get edited, and we'll let you know when that is done. Okay, so the agenda for today, we will go through and have some quick national updates, some quick regional updates as folks want to share. As I mentioned again, our focus topic is the efficacy of living shorelines approaches under extreme weather events. We are delighted to have Carter Smith with UNC Chapel Hill. And so with that, I will go ahead and do a couple of national updates. So for those of you who are keeping score, we are still on for the 2019 National Living Shorelines Tech Transfer Workshop, fall of 2019. I am delighted to say this is late-breaking news. I finally got the contracts in hand for our venues, and so I hope to be able to have some good news officially within the next week or so. The other thing is that the 2018 summit, in other words, the one that's just right around the corner in a couple of weeks, online registration ends today. So if you haven't figured that out yet, get your acting gear. We will have some fantastic, great Living Shorelines talks, sessions, and posters. And we are currently over 900 registrants as a whole. So it is going to be a fantastic event. Please make plans to join us. So at this point, I will take a quick break and see if anybody has any questions or updates they want to give. So again, remember, raise your hand virtually or send in a question. So now's the time to do that. Okay, hearing or seeing none, I am delighted to introduce Carter Smith. She is a fifth-year PhD candidate at UNC Chapel Hill's Institute of Marine Sciences. Her dissertation focuses on the socioeconomic and ecological effects of different shoreline management strategies, including living shorelines. Carter is passionate about using science to help inform sustainable development and coastal management. And with that, I will give Carter the screen and let her take it away.
Can everyone hear me? Suzanne, am I good?
Yes, you look good, sound good. Yep.
Oops. Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much to Restore America's Estuaries and to Suzanne for having me here today to talk about some of my dissertation research that's investigating how we can use living shorelines to enhance coastal resilience. And I'll jump right in by introducing this idea that coastal areas are very tightly coupled social ecological systems. So let me move this panel out of here, sorry. So on one hand, we have coastal ecosystems like salt marshes, oyster reefs, and seagrass beds. And then in a lot of cases, almost directly superimposed on top of these ecosystems, we have human systems that can be made up of waterfront homeowners or coastal communities more generally. And the actions and managements of these human systems, such as shoreline hardening, can have very severe consequences and impacts on the functioning of coastal ecosystems and in turn on the delivery of ecosystem services that are important to humans. And I bring this up just to show that ecosystems and human systems are tightly coupled. So the ecology is very valuable, but it might not be as valuable if we can't sort of find ways to make it important to the human systems, or as it might not integrate as well with management plans going forward if we can't show how valuable these systems are to humans. And so my research with living shorelines is looking at the ecology of living shorelines, but also at human decision-making along coastal areas and kind of trying to integrate those two components. And so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about some social science work that we've done on the human side, and then I'll slide a little bit more into the ecology and kind of try and integrate them throughout. And so I'm going to start off with some research that started in 2014 in North Carolina. This was actually a research project that I wasn't involved in at the beginning, but it was a survey of approximately 800 waterfront property owners in coastal North Carolina, distributed fairly evenly across the coast of North Carolina. And the purpose of this study was to find out what homeowners prioritize when they're deciding how to protect their shorelines, which shorelines they think are doing the best job at protecting their shorelines, and then also to gather some economic data about installation costs, maintenance costs, property damage costs, and hurricane impacts along these different types of shorelines. So the first figure up here was the response from our homeowners indicating which priority or which attributes they prioritize when deciding whether or not to harden their shoreline or deciding how to protect their shoreline. And we found that far and away, homeowners in North Carolina prioritize effectiveness, cost, and durability. And so this wasn't any great big surprise, but it's notable to show that while homeowners do consider ecological impact, they don't think about that nearly as much as they think about effectiveness and cost. And so really this one figure right here is going to guide a lot of my dissertation research more generally, and a lot of the research that I'm going to talk about going forward, because it sort of underscores this idea that we maybe don't want to be leading with the ecological benefits of living shorelines when we talk to coastal homeowners and managers. We want to be able to show them that living shorelines are effective and that they're not going to cost a lot of money in the long term. And so following up on this attribute priority question, we also asked our homeowners to rate these different types of shorelines based on how effective homeowners thought they were, how costly, how durable, and how much maintenance they required. And so the shoreline types that we included in this question were bulkheads, riprap, which is a sloping type of shoreline made out of granite boulders or concrete riprap, sills, which is just an offshore breakwater, sills with plantings, and then plantings alone. And the big takeaway from these images is that homeowners in North Carolina think that bulkheads are their most effective and their most durable option. Paradoxically, they also think that bulkheads require the most maintenance, but they also acknowledge that bulkheads are probably the most expensive. And just to extend these results to other areas, similar questions and similar studies have been done in other areas. And so this figure right here is from a paper by Stephen Zeifers in 2015, looking at surveying homeowners in Mobile Bay, Alabama. And Stephen found very similar results to what we found, that also in Mobile Bay in Alabama, homeowners are caring about effectiveness, durability, and cost over that environmental impact. And so building on these results, we were interested in kind of asking the question of whether or not bulkheads were living up to homeowner expectations of superior effectiveness for erosion control and durability. And so from this same study, this is some of the economic data that we were able to gather from our homeowners. And so we're just comparing here homeowners that had bulkhead shorelines, natural shorelines, and riprap shorelines, because those were the most common shoreline types, and none of the other shoreline types had sufficient responses to include in this analysis. And so we found that homeowners with bulkheads reported twice as much property damage costs compared to homeowners with natural and riprap shorelines. Yearly maintenance costs were 4 times as high as natural and riprap shorelines, although maintenance days were actually higher for riprap shorelines. And we think this is probably because homeowners are able to go out and maintain their riprap shorelines themselves. They can maybe rearrange some boulders if they're moved. Whereas if you have damage to a bulkhead, you probably have to bring a contractor in to help repair the damage. And so we're seeing here that bulkheads are definitely more expensive in terms of a dollar cost to maintain than other types of shorelines. But whether or not this is a function of them being damaged more isn't directly clear from these cost estimates. And so this was a study that was done in 2014 by Rachel Gitman, and it was looking at rates of shoreline damage in along estuarine shorelines in North Carolina. And so for this study, they went out with a visual damage assessment protocol in a boat, and they surveyed about, I think, 60 kilometers of shorelines, mostly in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and essentially recorded any time they saw any type of damage to a shoreline structure along those 60 kilometers. And the big conclusion from this paper was that 100% of visual damage that was observed on these surveys was attributable to a bulkhead shoreline or a shoreline that included a bulkhead. And in this column over here to the left, this was in Rodanthe, Waves, and Salvo, which is an area of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They saw that over 75% of bulkheads in this region were damaged. So really high rates of shoreline damage. And so we've repeated this methodology after several hurricanes in North Carolina. This is along a slightly different stretch of shoreline than what's reported in this first figure. But this is looking at the percent of bulkhead damage after Hurricane Irene in 2011, after Hurricane Arthur in 2014, and then we went and surveyed in 2016. So that was 2 years after Hurricane Arthur, presumably when most of the repair would have been made. And then we also surveyed right after Hurricane Matthew in 2016. And the big takeaway from this is that bulkheads are being damaged frequently, then they're being repaired, and then they're being damaged again. So we're seeing this pattern of damage, which is going to have high economic costs for homeowners and municipalities to repair. And one other thing that these surveys allowed us to do was look at changes or increases in shoreline hardening along this stretch of shoreline in the Outer Banks over a 5-year period. And so this is just looking at the breakdown of the 38 kilometers of shoreline that we surveyed based on shoreline type from 2011 to 2014 to 2016. And if you focus on this red box up at the top, this is just showing you the growth in shoreline hardening. And actually the area where we saw the most amount of growth was in these hybrid shorelines. And hybrid shorelines is a term that gets applied to a lot of different types of shoreline techniques. But in this case, we're talking about a shoreline that is combining multiple techniques. So in most cases in our study, that was a bulkhead that had a bunch of riprap in front of it, sometimes some riprap behind it, but it's multiple shoreline techniques. And so people seem to be building these bigger, quote unquote, better bulkheads, perhaps because they're not working the way that they'd like them to. And just to illustrate this, this was a picture taken in April 2016 of a shoreline that we surveyed as part of this study. And you can see that we've sort of jokingly referred to this house as the fortress, because there's riprap along the shoreline, there's a seawall behind that, then there's a retaining wall behind that, and they've got these sort of multiple levels of defense. And interestingly, when we went back and did this survey right after Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Sorry, these pictures are not the best, but if you look closely, you can see that the retaining wall has been almost entirely ripped out. There's been massive amounts of landward erosion behind that structure. And so this suggests that bigger is not always better. And so tying this in with living shorelines and some of the work that's been done looking at living shoreline resilience, this was one of the first studies looking at the effectiveness during hurricanes. It was done by Rachel Gitman in 2014. And she was comparing living shorelines. So those are going to be our black circles. And so the living shorelines that she was referring to in this study it's a natural marsh with an offshore breakwater made out of granite rocks. And those were being compared to control sites, which were just reference marshes along the same stretch of shoreline. And in this study, they were looking at trends in elevation across the entire marsh from 2010 to 2012, and also looking at vegetation density. And you can see down on the bottom, there's an arrow indicating where in that time point Hurricane Irene hit the coast. And so the takeaways from these figures were that there were no significant changes in elevation from before to after the storm at living shoreline sites or at control sites, but that generally living shoreline sites tended to have higher elevation in the marsh. And then while both living shorelines and natural marshes experienced a dip in vegetation density after Hurricane Irene, they both rebounded. Living shorelines rebounded slightly more than natural shorelines, but this wasn't a significant difference. And so we really wanted to build on this study and answer these two questions. First of all, do living shorelines maintain salt marsh vegetation? And then also, how do living shorelines, bulkheads, and natural marshes change in surface elevation and visual damage during a hurricane? And one of our big goals here was to directly compare living shorelines to traditional hardened shorelines. In some ways, it's sort of an apples to oranges comparison, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. But I think for promoting these types of structures to homeowners, we need to demonstrate their effectiveness as directly compared to more traditional options that are available to homeowners. And so again, this study was conducted in North Carolina. We had 4 areas across the coast of North Carolina, ranging from Ocracoke, sort of in the middle of the coast, down to Southport, which is down below Wilmington. And within each of these regions, we had a bulkhead, a living shoreline, and a marsh site. And we did the best that we could do to sort of maximize similarities between these sites in terms of the fetch that they were exposed to, the average wave climate, the orientation of the shoreline, etc. And for this study, when I use the term living shoreline, I'm specifically referring to a living shoreline that looks like this image over here on the left. So it's a salt marsh with this offshore rock breakwater. And it's worth mentioning up front that as far as the spectrum of living shoreline goes, this is a pretty engineered living shoreline. So keep that in mind as we sort of move through the results. And so at each of these sites, we used a pretty traditional marsh sampling methodology. We established permanent transects in 2015, and we looked at Spartina alterniflora stem density in plots along those transects, and also looked at elevation at plots along those transects. And so we started this study in 2015. We surveyed again in 2016, right before Hurricane Matthew. Then we sampled directly after Hurricane Matthew, and then finally sampled a year later to evaluate recovery. And so I'll walk you guys through some of the results. So this first slide is looking at changes in landward vegetation along these shorelines. It's worth noting that for vegetation, we're only comparing natural marshes to living shorelines. Bulkheads are not a part of this comparison because there was never any marsh present at any of our bulkhead sites. And so this first figure is looking at Spartina alterniflora stem densities per meter squared over time. And this is across the entire site. And so this is all landward plots comparing living shoreline to marsh. The gray line indicates when Hurricane Matthew hit the coast of North Carolina. But for statistical purposes, we just looked at the change from the beginning of the study to the end of the study for vegetation, because there were some inherent issues with seasonality. That's why you see this peak in vegetation even after the storm. And so across all of our landward plots, we didn't see a significant difference in stem densities between living shorelines and marshes. However, we also looked at just the change in edge vegetation. And so we had planned on doing this because we sort of knew that lateral marsh erosion is a really important component of erosion, and that's often where you have a lot of marsh loss. And so we saw a slightly different story here. You can see that the living shorelines and the marshes in our study both started off with almost the exact same average stem density. But over time, our living shoreline sites increased in stem densities, whereas the natural sites, almost every site had significantly lost vegetation, and at many of them, edge vegetation was no longer present. And so at least in our study over this 2-year period, this suggests that living shorelines can maintain that edge salt marsh vegetation. And so moving on to our elevation results, this first panel is looking at the change in landward elevation over plots that go 6 meters in from the shoreline. And this first plot is just looking at change in elevation from directly before Hurricane Matthew to after Hurricane Matthew. And for this one, we're comparing marshes, that rock-sill living shoreline again, and bulkheads. And so here we found that living shorelines resisted landward erosion significantly better than marshes and marginally significantly better than bulkheads. So on average, all of the living shorelines in our study roughly maintained landward elevation throughout the storm, whereas all of our marshes and all of our bulkheads lost elevation during the storm. And then looking at the change in elevation over the entire study period, we saw that both living shorelines and bulkheads had significantly more elevation gain behind the structure than natural marshes, which suggests that over time, both of these living shorelines and bulkheads are doing a fairly good job at maintaining landward elevation. However, there's a really important distinction here between our living shorelines and our bulkheads. For the bulkheads in our survey, there's no significant mechanism by which sediment can accrete behind the bulkhead naturally. So if you have an erosion event like we saw during Hurricane Matthew, that sediment behind that shoreline structure, behind that wall, is not going to fill in naturally. And so the increase that we see here by the end of the study is necessarily a result of homeowner repair. Whereas living shorelines, this increase is presumably natural. And just to give you all an idea of what that looks like, this is one of the bulkheads that was included in our study, and this picture was taken just a few days after Hurricane Matthew. And so you can see there's significant structural damage. A lot of the boards have been popped up in the center area, and here there's been pretty significant landward erosion where they've actually had to come and fill it in with rocks. And so this was true for 3 of the 4 bulkheads in our study. They had some kind of visual erosion or structural damage from Hurricane Matthew. And when we went back 9 months after the storm to look at that shoreline, the bulkhead had been repaired, the sediment had been refilled in, and it had been resodded. So it was mechanisms like this that were contributing to that, that ultimate increase in elevation behind the structure. Notably, we've also gone back and resurveyed these properties after Hurricane Florence passed just a couple of weeks ago. And this is that same shoreline again, right after Hurricane Florence. You can see massive erosion behind the structure again. We didn't get back to this shoreline quite as quickly. And so actually all the boards that you see here along the top are brand new. And so it probably looked a lot worse right after the storm because it looked like they had already come in and done some repair when that picture was taken. Similarly, 3 of the 4 natural marshes in our study had some kind of visual erosion. When we started our surveys, we marked the beginning of each of our transects with PVC pipes. And so visually, we were just able to assess lateral marsh retreat by noticing whether or not the marsh was still starting where that PVC pipe was or if it had gone backwards. But that was just a qualitative assessment. And then conversely, we didn't notice any kind of visual damage to rock sills, although it's important to note here that it would be harder to detect damage to a rock sill than it would be to a bulkhead, because we might not notice a rock that's out of place versus it's pretty obvious when a board is out of place on a bulkhead. So there are a couple of big caveats for this study. The first is that these results were only the result of one storm, Hurricane Matthew, which in many ways was kind of an unusual storm, and it didn't actually make direct landfall in North Carolina, caused a ton of estuarine shoreline damage and lots of flooding, but never actually made landfall. Also, this study is looking at one type of living shoreline, which is a fairly engineered type of living shoreline. And so hopefully studies like this will be repeated in other locations, different types of storms, presumably with different inundation regimes. The types of damage that we're seeing could be very different, especially with different types of living shorelines. And then finally, sort of trying to tie this back into homeowner decision making, it's important to note that we are really just looking at damage to the shoreline here, and we're looking at changes in elevation and vegetation in a relatively narrow swath of shoreline. So we were just looking at 6 meters waterward and 6 meters shoreward of that shoreline. And so what you might be wondering, and what we certainly wondered after this study, was, okay, but what does this mean for damage to homes during Hurricane Matthew? Because it's very likely that there are homeowners out there that don't mind if they have to come back and repair their bulkhead after every single hurricane, as long as it's doing a superior job of protecting their home. And so we wanted to follow up some of our Hurricane Matthew field surveys with another social science survey that was trying to correlate home damage to shoreline damage. And so we put out a new survey to North Carolina waterfront residents a couple of months after Hurricane Matthew. We got about 300 responses back, and I'm going to present these again. It's just bulkhead shorelines, natural shorelines, and riprap shorelines. We didn't have enough homeowners that actually had engineered living shorelines to be able to include them in this analysis. But this first figure right here is looking at whether or not homeowners reported that their shoreline was damaged or was not damaged during Hurricane Matthew. And so what we see here is that there was no significant difference in the amount of shoreline damage that was experienced by bulkhead, natural, or riprap shorelines. It is somewhat notable that both homeowners there was a higher frequency of homeowners with natural and riprap shorelines that tended to report damage. And so there's probably been an underreport of damage to natural shorelines from some of our other studies, because it's harder to visually evaluate damage to natural shorelines. And so we just haven't included those. And then really interestingly, and this was not at all what we expected, we asked homeowners to report whether or not their home was or was not damaged by shoreline type. And what we found was that homeowners with bulkheads actually had significantly more home damage during Hurricane Matthew than homeowners with natural shorelines, and riprap shorelines were not significantly different from either. And so what we think might be going on here, oh, and I should mention, this is preliminary data from this survey, and so this has not been peer reviewed or published yet. But what we think might be going on is that the best predictor of shoreline type for all of the respondents in our survey was the distance between the house and the shoreline. And so if you look over on the left, in this figure right here, if the home was less than approximately 35 meters from the shoreline, there was an 89% of those respondents had a hardened shoreline. Whereas on the other side, if the home was further than 56 meters from the shoreline, then 70% of the homeowners had a natural shoreline. And so this sort of suggests that there's this this vulnerability to homes with hardened shorelines where, and we don't know what the mechanism is here, and I can speculate about it later if anyone's interested. But what we think is just that homes with hardened shorelines are closer to the water than homes with natural shorelines, and so they're inherently going to be more vulnerable to storms. And so I'm still struggling a little bit with what the takeaway here is, but what we think the takeaway is that if you're living that close to the shoreline, such as these homes that are in these photos up here, it probably doesn't really matter what type of shoreline you have. That home is likely to be damaged during storms. And then finally, this is my last slide. I just want to point out that not all living shorelines are created equal. And so it's important that we look at how different types of shorelines in different locations are performing overall and also performing during storms. This photo series is from a oyster bag sill living shoreline. So this is a technique that's fairly common in North Carolina, where you take these plastic Vexar bags and you stuff them with oyster shell, and then you build a sill out of those. In this first picture over here, you can see that the bags have torn, there's plastic mesh all over the marsh, there are lots of loose shells. And then in this time series, you can see the arrows are pointing to similar locations. But essentially over this 2-year period, this oyster bag sill has migrated inland. There's been massive amounts of accretion. A lot of the bags have ripped. And as I visited this site over time, I just sort of thought to myself that this site was the perfect example of a living shoreline completely failing and not doing what it was supposed to be doing, because you no longer have great habitat for fish behind the sill. You have plastics that have been introduced. But interestingly, I talked to the manager of this coastal land trust, and they were absolutely thrilled with this living shoreline because it had stopped the erosion. There'd been tons of accretion along the shoreline. And so this introduces the idea that different people may have different ideas of what a successful project looks like. And I think going forward, we need to be really clear about what our intentions are and what the primary objective of these living shoreline projects are, so that we can properly evaluate their success and promote them to the people that are installing them. And then finally, I just think this is a cool study that illustrates that ecosystem service benefits of living shorelines take time to develop. So this was a study done by Manis et al. In 2014, and it was a wave tank study where they were looking at the effects of simulated boat waves on control shorelines, on shorelines with just plantings, shorelines with just oyster reefs, and shorelines with oyster reefs and plantings. So various types of living shorelines. And what they found was that, first of all, not only were oysters and salt marsh better than just a control shoreline without them for attenuating boat wakes, but if you allowed those shorelines a year to establish and develop and grow, they were significantly better than they were when they started. And so some living shorelines might develop the ability to be more resilient. It might not necessarily enhance resilience immediately, which I think is something that we also need to consider going forward. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions or dive into some more details about the studies that I talked about. And I'll also mention, if anybody has trouble getting access to some of the journals that these papers are published in, there are PDFs of all of them on the website that's listed right there in case you want access to them. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carter. That was fantastic. I know this is something that, and I'll take the screen back, or we can leave it up that way. That's fine. That way your email is front and center, which is fantastic. So at this point in time, I would like to open it up to question and answer. And as I mentioned before, please use either the hand function, the raising your hand function, or the question function within the webinar control panel. And so as folks start to type on that, I do have a couple of questions that I would welcome your thoughts. One is a bit of a context. So what is the typical tidal range for these sites? Because I think that would be helpful for people to understand. And then what was the approximate storm surge for these different storms? Because I know that can be one of the big issues in these storms.
Sure. I don't have a super clear-cut answer because North Carolina has a pretty expansive coastline, and so up in the north of North Carolina's coastline, it's predominantly wind-driven tides, and so there's not necessarily a huge actual tidal range. Whereas down south by Wilmington, where some of our southernmost sites were, 1.5 meters, or at least a meter of tides. And then also in terms of storm surge, it completely depended where you were along the coast. During Hurricane Matthew, I believe the Hatteras area of the Outer Banks, Frisco, Rodanthe, Waves, and Salvo, those areas experienced 6 feet of storm surge, whereas other areas further down south experienced very little. And there was also a lot of riverine flooding during Hurricane Matthew, and so inundation could have been very different depending on how close people were to riverine flooding. So not an easy answer to that.
Sorry about that. Well, I thought it was important, though, so people at least started to get some sense of what the conditions are, simply because we have people from all around the country, from Washington State all the way down through around the Gulf and up the East Coast all the way to Nova Scotia. So I think it's helpful for people to understand some of these things. We do have a hand raised, so I will unmute Bill Shadle with the Nature Conservancy. Bill, go ahead.
Hi, great presentation. I'm going to follow up by email to ask you for some more questions. But
sure.
Early on in the presentation, you had a slide, and I'm sorry I can't tell you exactly where, but it was a bar graph, and it was something like % bulkhead. I think maybe damage was on it. Was the response?
Yes, I know which one. This one on the left.
Yeah, could you just explain that one a little?
Sure. So essentially, so this study is the one by Gitman et al. From 2014. And so they surveyed, I think, about 60 kilometers of shoreline in the Outer Banks. And so this is showing just the bulkhead shoreline that they surveyed and the different types of damage that they observed. And so, for instance, collapse would have been literally the entire bulkhead was ripped away from the shoreline. Breach means that water could get behind the shoreline. Landward erosion is that you can see that land has actually eroded behind the structure, and structural damage was maybe boards missing or damage to the structure itself. And so the x-axis here were 4 different regions of shorelines. So sorry if that wasn't clear. Rodanthe, Waves, and Salvo is the RWS. And then Frisco and Hatteras, all 3 of those are in the Outer Banks. And then Bogue Banks is a shoreline that's sort of down in the middle of coastal North Carolina.
Did you say, and maybe I misunderstood your takeaway. I thought you had a takeaway from this saying something like all bulkheads were damaged. I'm saying, obviously that's not true. I must have misunderstood since you have no damage on here as an option.
No, sorry. So I know exactly what you're talking about. So the reason why this graph is here, which is presenting the % of bulkhead damage, was because no damage was observed to other types of shorelines.
Oh, right.
So the riprap revetments that they surveyed, the living shorelines that were included along these shoreline stretches had no visual damage.
Okay, great. Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Sure.
All righty. Thanks, Bill. All right, we have a question. This is for you, Carter, obviously. How soon or quickly after the storm events were the sites surveyed? So that's question 1. And part 2 of that is how or what methodology was used to measure elevation changes?
Sure. So we surveyed all of our sites, I want to say within 2 weeks of the storm. maybe 3 weeks at the outside. So we really made a push to get back and look at changes as fast as we possibly could in these locations. For the actual sampling methodology, we did transects at every site. So we had between 5 and 7 transects, and then we had plots every 3 meters along those sites. And we used a laser level and leveling rod, or we used an RTK GPS. And we averaged across all of our sites. So we averaged across plots as our sites to look at changes in average elevation. Yeah, I think, does that answer the question?
I certainly hope so, because I am not 100% sure. So if the person who asked that question, if you would like to send another follow-up, by all means. We have another question. Hang on, where'd it go? Now it's misbehaving. So there's somebody who has their hand raised, and yes. So Alexia, you need to put in your audio pin in order for me to unmute you. So if you add that, then I can unmute you at that time. There is another question that has come in. Oh, yes, and I'm happy to say that your question was answered. Or you answered the question. Yay! All right. So what other factors besides distance from shore did you test to explain the differences in home damage relative to shoreline type? Also, how did you define quote-unquote damage in your survey to homeowners? In other words, was there a scale to the response, or was it just yes or no, or to any kind of damage?
Great question. So we have all sorts of information looking at what the best predictors of damage were. So we pulled a lot of environmental parameters, such as average fetch, maximum fetch, direction of maximum fetch, flood zone. We actually went on Google Street View and used real estate websites to look up pictures of the homes to evaluate whether or not the homes were elevated. And then we also asked homeowners a whole variety of questions about their homes and shorelines, and we included all of those in the model. And so I will say distance to shoreline was not the best predictor of damage to a home. Flood zone was the best predictor of damage to the home. Distance to shoreline was the best predictor of shoreline type. So I'm not sure if that answers that. Yeah, did I answer both questions? Sorry, did I forget the second part?
I think it was whether there were any other than yes or no. Like, was there any kind of gradation?
Oh, yes. So there were several questions addressing that. The question that we're currently probably going to include is just looking at essentially a binary of, was your home damaged, was your home not damaged? But then we do have a lot more information. If they said yes, their home was damaged, we could get the types of damage that they experienced. And we did in the question specifically ask about water damage, not wind damage, to their homes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Lexia Weaver with the North Carolina Coastal Federation has a question. Lexia, you're on the air.
Hi, everyone. Carter, great presentation. I will certainly continue to use your recommendations when I deal with the multiple property owners that call us with recommendations on what to do with their shorelines. I just mostly wanted to make a quick comment. So I obviously work a lot with oyster shell bags.
Right.
I just to mention to everyone, I just didn't want everyone to get the wrong impression that project that Carter presented a couple slides at the end, that was maybe one of maybe 2 projects that have quote unquote failed with the bags ripping and everything out of the multiple, at least over 25 projects that we've done with oyster bags. And that site right there is so high energy. It's a very high energy site, and which explains, why the bags didn't work there, but put in these bags at multiple locations, and they've done very well, and they survived past our recent Hurricane Florence and then, or tropical storm, I guess, when it passed by here, Michael. So they did really well. The bags were intact and they didn't break apart or anything like that. So I just wanted to mention that site is just particularly unique in that it's very high energy, and it definitely needs a lot more, a more structural living shoreline there to protect that shoreline. But again, that importance of what you consider success in your project is one that we need to think about in the future. So just wanted to.
Thanks so much, Lexia. That's a really important point to make, because I agree. We've also surveyed plenty of oyster bag sills in North Carolina that have done fine in lower energy environments. I mostly included that slide because I thought it was so interesting that the way that I defined success as sort of a more ecological scientist was very different from how the property owners defined success on that project. So definitely something to keep in mind. But thanks, Lexia. Great comment.
Thank you, Carter.
Thanks, Lexia. All right, we have another question that has come in, let's see. Thanks for the presentation. Was there any monitoring conducted of the fish community response to the installed living shorelines?
Great question. So sort of. If you look at, Rachel Gitman has a paper in 2016 in ecological applications, and I think Carolyn Curran, who works at NOAA out here, also has a paper in wetlands ecology and management, I believe both of them look at the before-after fish community. I know that a takeaway from Rachel Gitman's paper was that they didn't survey long enough to actually see whether or not the fish community had been enhanced. It was not immediately enhanced right after installation. And actually, I've gone back and surveyed a lot of those sites for the fish community doing pike netting. So we have this sort of longer, I think, 5-year before after control impact design, looking specifically at the fish community. I have not published on that data yet, and it's not in a particularly compiled form. So I'm not sure I can give you any good thoughts on that, but it's definitely been done to some extent, and is continuing to be done in other ways.
So that sounds like another request for proposal opportunity, right? So.
Yes.
Exactly right. So all of you at federal agencies, think about that in your next RFP release. All right. So we do have a question. So I think there's a little bit of confusion about the graphic that you're still showing.
Sure.
I think some folks are interpreting this as I think they're seeing that bulkheads are performing great. In other words, that there is no damage to a majority of bulkheads. And so can you maybe explain that a little bit more? Or because I think that then the follow-up question, which is one from me, which is how do we take all this information to try to get more people on board, in terms of using living shorelines a little bit more?
Sure. And I guess I would say if you're looking at this graphic on the left and seeing, relatively low rates of damage in areas like Frisco and Hatteras and Bogue Banks, and you think that looks great for bulkheads, then, that's certainly a matter of perspective. And so maybe that is an acceptable amount of damage or repair, depending on who you are looking at that graphic. So I'm not here necessarily to place a strong value judgment on that. The only thing I will say is that, especially coming from, I think it's the slide below this, if our homeowners are caring about effectiveness, cost, and specifically durability, these data to me suggest that bulkheads are themselves are not necessarily durable, that they are consistently being damaged every couple of years during storms. And in most cases, that damage is then being repaired and then they're being damaged again. So I think it needs to, and when you look at bulkheads, I think most construction firms will tell you that a bulkhead has a life of 50 years, which might be true, but that is probably also belying to homeowners that over the course of those 50 years, they're likely going to need significant amounts of repair after storms or just kind of annual upkeep. So I see it less as a bulkheads are bad, they're getting damaged so much, as bulkheads are definitely getting damaged, and homeowners, I think, could be more aware than they currently are of the investments that they're going to have to continue making to maintain and repair their bulkheads.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question has come in. The question, I'm going to read it verbatim. I think you said that living shoreline showed an increase in stem density in edge vegetation while natural sites lost edge vegetation. What do you think is driving this outcome?
So I think, keep in mind the sites that we chose for this study were stretches of shoreline that there was a living shoreline and there was a bulkhead. And so that suggests that some kind of shoreline protection is probably needed in these areas. So they're slightly higher energy areas, either because of boat traffic or just because of what the fetch environment looks like or whatever it is. And so I think at our natural marsh sites, we're seeing lateral erosion of the marsh. So one of our sites, I had a picture of it and I think I got rid of it. But because of boat wakes, the marsh was literally calving off chunks like an iceberg would at the rate of, a meter, maybe more a year. And so we're losing stem densities at the edge there because there's marsh slumping and you're losing that marsh edge. And I think to a lesser extent, that's also what we're seeing in all of our natural marshes. And for the living shoreline, I think it could be that the sill is breaking some of the wave energy, and so it's making it a more hospitable environment for salt marsh to grow in. But I'm not sure what the mechanism is there. That's just kind of a speculation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now we're going to go to Jim Johannesson up in the Pacific Northwest. So Jim, I'm going to unmute you now. Jim, you there?
Yeah. Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks for the presentation, Carter. That was a nice focused study, nice clear presentation. You're the last thing you said, just a quick comment. You mentioned, I was kind of wondering about this. You're seeing erosion at all of the natural shore sites you went to. Well, I'm sure I'm speculating that's natural erosion. Perhaps that's exacerbated by outside development features. Of course, being a geologist, sometimes I have to try to explain to people that erosion does happen, and perhaps sometimes they should think about living with it instead of modifying their shoreline. That's my 2 cents. I have 2 questions. Maybe I'll give them to you one at a time. Make it easy for you. They're quick. One is, how did you get permission to these private sites? Did you have to go out and solicit that ahead of time? Did you, just show up and ask? Did you always have permission?
Sure. Yeah. As far as your first comment goes, it's a great point, and it's something that I usually introduce as a caveat before I talk about this. That yes, erosion is a natural process. Sometimes it's exacerbated by human processes, but it really becomes a problem when you build communities and shorelines in areas where you have an eroding shoreline. And so the big caveat for a lot of this research is that in some circumstances, a living shoreline is not going to solve your problem either. Maybe people just shouldn't be living where they're living. And so I'll leave that there and answer your actual question, which now I'm forgetting what it was. I'm sorry.
About did you need to get permission?
Yes.
How cumbersome was that?
It was fairly cumbersome. So I would say that took almost on and off, that took almost my entire first field season, mostly because there aren't that many living shoreline projects across the coast of North Carolina. And so finding suitable shoreline stretches where we had a living shoreline that was in close proximity to a bulkhead and a natural marsh, and where we could get permission to access all of those properties was challenging. We used a combination of some public sites. got homeowner information from people that had previously worked at some of the living shoreline and bulkhead sites. And then I did a combination of sending letters out to homeowners that I'd sort of identified through Google Earth might be good candidates for the study, and also just went around knocking on people's doors, asking them if I could sample their shoreline. And generally, it was all very well met, and people were really interested in the science and excited to be a part of it. I'll say that. So great experience working with all the private property owners.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Yeah, we did a bunch of similar case studies, and probably no surprise to your listeners here, it seemed like we got a better response being a private firm or you as a researcher as opposed to, yes, indeed, a government employee. But okay, so my last question is, you mentioned you did a survey up front and you had some information on people's concerns, which is great. I'm wondering if you had any data you didn't present yet today to this short thing regarding the actual cost of projects. So not, the cost was a concern or it was high or low, but if you actually recorded costs for living shorelines or bulkheads or anything else.
Looking at installation costs?
Yeah.
I did not report it, and we didn't ask it in our most recent survey, but a paper just came out, I want to say earlier this year or last year, by Rachel Gitman and Steven Zeifers. It's in Shore and Beach, and it's a composition of some of the survey data from the surveys that I presented here with survey data that had been done in other areas of the Gulf Coast and also, I think, in parts of Florida. And so it amalgamated all of that data and reports installation costs for all types of shorelines. And so that would be a phenomenal resource if you're looking for that information. If you email me, I'm happy to send you that paper. I have easy access to it.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, thank you, Jim. All right, so that was fantastic. I love the robust Q&A. I tell people that we can usually fill up, 30 minutes of Q&A, and nobody believes me, but they need to be on one of these, clearly. All right, so I'm going to take the screen back, and there we go. So thank you all for joining us today. If you would like to be on the email list to receive information about future webinars and teleconferences, sometimes we switch between them depending on what the goals of that month's virtual gathering is, go ahead and email me. My email is up there. If you have questions for Carter directly, by all means, email her. She, as you guys all heard, was happy to provide information, particularly on the papers. Do not ask me some of the more technical things. She is far better to answer that. In deference to the holidays and to the summit, the Ray CSO Summit coming up in Long Beach, which I hope I will see most of you there, we will not be having anything in December. So take a month off from this particular activity, enjoy yourself, enjoy the holidays, and we will come back nice and refreshed in January. So with that, Carter, thank you very much again, and happy holidays, and we will reconvene in January. Thank you, and have a great holiday. Take care.